In one single night, in one single room, a group of men sat around a table and divided an entire continent between themselves. No African was in that room. No African was consulted. No African even knew it was happening. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, the fate of over 200 million people had already been decided. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is history. And somehow, they forgot to teach it to most of us. Welcome back to Timeless Chronicles, the channel where history stops being a boring subject and starts feeling like the most gripping story you have ever heard. If you are new here, I am glad you found us. And if you have been here before, you already know what we do. We dig into the moments that shaped our world, and we tell them the way they were always meant to be told. Today's story is one that does not get nearly enough attention. And by the end of this video, I think you will understand exactly why. The year is 1884. Europe is in the middle of something that historians would later call the Scramble for Africa. But that phrase, the Scramble for Africa, makes it sound almost casual, almost playful, like a group of children rushing towards something exciting. But what was really happening was far from a game. It was a calculated, cold, and ruthless plan to claim the richest continent on Earth. Africa in 1884 was not an empty land. It was home to ancient kingdoms, thriving cultures, complex trade routes, and hundreds of millions of people who had built civilizations long before Europe had running water. The Kingdom of Congo, the Mali Empire, the Zulu Nation, Great Zimbabwe. These were not small villages. These were powerful, organized societies with their own governments, their own laws, their own economies. But Europe did not see any of that. Or rather, Europe chose not to. What Europe saw was land, resources, gold, ivory, rubber, diamonds, and the one thing every empire has always craved above everything else, power. So they called a meeting. And what happened inside that meeting room in Berlin, Germany would change Africa forever. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, sent out the invitations. 14 nations responded: Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, the Ottoman Empire. The United States even sent a representative. Though they had no African ambitions of their own at the time, they simply wanted a seat at the table where the world was being reshaped. They called it the Berlin Conference. It ran from November 1884 to February 1885. And in those few months, the entire map of Africa was redrawn by men who had never set foot on African soil. Think about that for a moment. These men were drawing borders through mountains, rivers, forests, and villages they had never seen. They were splitting ethnic groups in half, separating families, cutting ancient kingdoms apart with a pencil and a ruler. And they did it with the confidence of people who believed, truly believed, that they had every right to do so. But what happened next changed everything for the people who actually lived there. The rules they made for themselves. The Berlin Conference was not just about dividing land. It was about creating rules. Rules that would make the whole operation look legal, look civilized, look justified. The most important rule they created was called effective occupation. This meant that if a European country wanted to claim a piece of Africa, they had to actually be present there. They had to set up administration, establish trade, and prove they were in control. Simply drawing a line on a map was no longer enough. You had to back it up with boots on the ground. On the surface, this sounds almost reasonable. But here is what that rule actually meant in practice. It meant European powers now had every reason to rush into Africa as fast as possible, to plant their flags, to build their forts, to force Africans into labor, into submission, into silence. Because if you were not there first, someone else would be. And so the scramble became a sprint. Within just 15 years of the Berlin Conference, over 90% of Africa was under European control. 90%. A continent of millions, ancient and powerful, carved up like a loaf of bread on a dinner table. The human cost no one talks about. Here is the part of the story that history books tend to rush past. When those borders were drawn, they did not just divide land. They divided people. The Maasai people found themselves split between what is now Kenya and Tanzania. The Somali people were cut into 5 different territories controlled by different European powers. The Yu people of West Africa were divided between British Gold Coast and German Togoland. Families who had lived as one community for generations suddenly woke up in different countries, under different rulers, speaking different colonial languages. And for those who resisted, the consequences were devastating. In what is now Namibia, the German colonial forces carried out what many historians recognize as the first genocide of the 20th century against the Herero and Nama people. Tens of thousands were killed. Survivors were driven into the desert to die of thirst. It happened quietly, far from European newspapers, far from public outrage. In the Congo, King Leopold II of Belgium did not just claim land. He turned the entire territory into his personal property, not Belgium's, his. And under his rule, the Congolese people were forced to harvest rubber at impossible quotas. Those who failed had their hands cut off. Children, women, men. An estimated 10 million people died during Leopold's reign over the Congo. 10 million. And almost no one knew. Because Leopold made sure the world only saw the version of the story he wanted them to see. If this story is hitting different for you, if you are feeling that mix of anger and disbelief that comes with learning something that should have been taught long ago, do me one favor. Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm this story matters, and it helps more people find it. And if you are not subscribed to Timeless Chronicles yet, now is the time. We tell the stories they left out of your textbooks, every single week. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss one. Now, back to Berlin. The legacy that lives today. Here is something that will make you see today's world completely differently. The borders drawn at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885 are almost exactly the same borders that exist in Africa today. Think about that. Lines drawn by European strangers, in a room in Germany, over a century ago, still define where one African nation ends and another begins. Those artificial borders created tensions that never fully healed. Different ethnic groups forced to share nations they never chose. Languages imposed. Religions pushed. Cultures suppressed. And when the colonial powers eventually left in the mid-20th century, they left behind countries built not on African foundations, but on European convenience. The conflicts you read about today in Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Somalia, in Nigeria, they did not appear from nowhere. They have roots. Deep roots. And many of those roots lead straight back to one room in Berlin in the winter of 1884. This is not about blame for the sake of blame. It is about understanding. Because you cannot solve a wound you do not know exists. The voices that fought back. But here is what they really did not teach you. Africa did not simply accept what happened. Not everyone bowed. Not everyone surrendered. Ethiopia stood firm. Under Emperor Menelik II, Ethiopia crushed the Italian army at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. It was one of the most stunning military victories in history. An African nation, using African strategy, defeated a European colonial army and remained independent throughout the entire colonial period. It sent a message that shook Europe to its core. Africa was not powerless. Africa was not without leadership. Africa was not what they claimed it to be. Queen Asantewaa of the Ashanti Empire led a war against the British in 1900 when her king was exiled, and the men around her were too afraid to fight. She stood up in front of the chiefs and said words that still echo today. She shamed the men into action. She led the resistance herself. And even when she was eventually captured and exiled, her name lived on as a symbol of defiance that no colonial border could contain. These stories exist. They are real. They just did not fit the narrative Europe wanted to tell. On February 26, 1885, the final act of the Berlin Conference was signed. The deal was done. Africa had been divided. And the world that came after, the conflicts, the poverty, the power struggles, the identities lost and the cultures erased, all of it traces a line back to that moment. But here is what I want you to carry with you after watching this. The people who were divided were never broken. The kingdoms that were carved up never disappeared from memory. The resistance never fully died. And the story of Africa is not a story that ended in Berlin. It is a story that is still being written. By Africans. On their own terms. History tried to silence a continent. But you cannot silence a continent. And now that you know this story, it is your job to make sure it is not forgotten. If this video opened your eyes to something you never learned in school, share it with someone who needs to see it. Leave a comment below telling me which part surprised you the most. I read every single one. Like this video if you believe history should be told honestly, not selectively. And if you are not yet part of the Timeless Chronicles family, subscribe right now. Because we are just getting started, and the next story we tell might be the one that changes how you see the world all over again. I will see you in the next one.